Dr. Marc Lamont Hill. Dr. Hill comes to us from Philadelphia, where he is a professor of education at Columbia University. Aside from being an academic, Dr. Hill is also a journalist, commentator, and activist. Hill's research focuses on the intersection between culture, politics, and education. His activism centers on education and serving underprivileged youth. In years past, he has founded a nonprofit organization aiming to educate underprivileged youth about their legal rights and responsibilities, and started a literacy project that uses hip-hop culture to increase school engagement and reading skills among high school students. We are so excited to have Dr. Marc Lamont Hill here. He is a great person, and we're just very excited. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Marc Lamont Hill.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am really excited to be here. I am always excited to travel around the country and talk to students, talk to activists, talk to organizers who are doing work on the ground that matters, but there is no topic that matters to me more than the topic of mass incarceration. And so when I got the invite to do this, I was overwhelmed. And when I heard that Angela Davis would be here, I'm always honored and humbled to be in her presence. Y'all took it up a notch. Y'all told me I had to go after her. That is so not fair. Oh man, but I'm honored to do so. I'm honored to be here. I'm honored to talk to you all just for a little bit about some of the issues that I've been thinking about, some of the work that I've been doing with regard to this mass incarceration crisis. I'm going to focus. Professor Davis laid out so many pieces of this, from the global perspective to the political economy of prisons to the various identity politics that sort of intersect with the prison crisis. I want to talk to you a bit about what I think is a key piece of the mass incarceration crisis, and that is the thing that we can call the war on youth. The war on youth. I think that there is a war on young people that plays itself in various ways, but ultimately only serves to bolster the prison industrial complex. The first thing that I want us to think about, though, are some strategies for how we can get at this problem. The first thing we need to think about is the need for a sense of history. There is a profound need for a sense of history in this country. Andres Hussein, the great cultural theorist, talks about America as having the great time paradox. On the one hand, we are obsessed with remembering. Part of the neoliberal project, in fact, is finding all sorts of ways to collectively self-congratulate, finding new ways to commemorate, new ways to profit off of memory, new ways to expand our mnemonic devices. We have built more museums and more mausoleums in the last 20 or 30 years than at any moment in human history, in fact. We have constructed more opportunities to remember stuff. Even in pop culture, you have TV shows like Best Week Ever. You know, the kind of instant nostalgia, you know, you watch those shows like NBA Wives or The Bachelor or any of the other shows, and they have the reunion episode a week after the show is over. You know, there's a kind of collective obsession with remembering that, again, gets profitized and monetized in all these ways that allows us to feel comforted in thinking that we actually have a sense of history. But the great time paradox is in place because at the very same time that we have this obsession with remembering, we also have this obsession with forgetting, with erasing particular things from our collective and individual memories, from forgetting collective trauma. I mean, perhaps the most profound example is the example of Barack Obama himself. Right? He sort of emerges out of a tradition. He emerges out of a political project, a particular political project, not mine, but a particular political project. And I remember on August 28th, 2008, when he became the Democratic Party's nominee, the first thing that the media did was say, oh my God, August 28th, 2008, Barack Obama becomes the Democratic Party's nominee. That was 45 years to the day after August 28th, 1963, when Martin Luther King gives his I Have a Dream speech. And there was a kind of, there's a kind of a Disney moment there, right? Where you could have this King dreaming in 63 and Obama fulfilling dreams in 08, and you could really have this liberal bourgeois fantasy of the completion of democracy right at your fingertips. The problem with that kind of sense of history is that it forgets August 28, 2005, when Katrina reaches its height, and an entire generation of poor people, an entire community of poor people are washed away and rendered disposable. You also have August 28th, 1955, when Emmett Till is murdered, and a kind of state-sponsored terrorism that, again, speaks to the disposability of black bodies and the vulnerability of black male bodies in particular in public space. That's not to suggest that black female bodies aren't equally vulnerable in public space, just in different ways. So there's this fascinating way that we love to forget and to remember. And so when I think about the prison crisis, I don't want us to think about it as a crisis of the moment. As Professor Davis said, we have to immediately go back to the convict lease system. We have to immediately go back to slavery. We have to immediately go back to every single moment in human history where the American economic system has been bolstered, in fact, supported, in fact, constructed through the exploitation of black and brown male and female bodies. That has to be the groundwork for this. That has to be the groundwork for any project that examines the prison crisis. And so I can't help, whenever I get a sense of history, particularly around this issue, I can't help but encounter Du Bois. I can't help but encounter Black Reconstruction in particular, because I think when we examine a text like Black Reconstruction, it not only gives us a sense of history, but it gives us a sense of the material and economic stakes attached to a racialized prison industry. And despite the numbers that came out about a week ago that suggested that the black incarceration crisis is dropping, and we can talk about that, and perhaps in the Q&A, both of us can sort of talk about why those numbers are problematic and how we can't allow that to lure us into a false sense of security. At the very same time that we should be glad that some incarceration numbers are dropping. But nevertheless, there is a kind of Du Boisian opportunity here to think about the racialized stakes of the prison crisis. One of the first things that I was forced to think about was, well, with such mass incarceration, why isn't there a public outcry? Why isn't there a public response from blacks and whites collectively about mass incarceration? And it's interesting because it would seem to me that as long as black labor is being exploited, as long as brown labor is being exploited, then there's an opportunity for even white workers, for white poor people all around this country to organize and galvanize around this issue, because they're actually equally crippled economically when labor's being exploited, even through the prison industry. And Du Bois raised this very question in the first 3 chapters of Black Reconstruction. He says, why would the white worker side with the planting class and not the slave? I mean, it's a fundamental question, and it's not that different than the question we ask right now when we say, why do white poor people vote for the Bush tax cuts? Right? I mean, it's fundamentally the same question. What is their material investment in mass incarceration? What is their material investment in an industry that actually exploits labor of everybody? And Du Bois said, well, the white worker should be siding to end slavery, because as long as there are slaves in existence, there is a lack of a fertile labor market for them. In other words, slave masters don't retire, right? And slaves exist, and as long as there's a slave whose labor can be exploited, and we have to always think about this as labor and not work, and not just work or slavery, but as long as their labor is being exploited, then the white worker will never have an opportunity to get economic justice. And so he said, well, why wouldn't they do that? And in the 3rd chapter of Black Reconstruction, when he talks about the planting class, he raises this notion of the psychic wages of whiteness. He says that the white worker actually has a psychic or psychological investment in the existence of slavery, not because it corresponds to their economic interests, but because they're able to close ranks around an identity. They're able to close ranks around a notion of whiteness that allows them to have some sort of fullness and completion in their identity at the expense of their own material well-being. Now, that kind of thing is interesting when we think about the prison crisis, because we're wrestling with the very same problem. Labor is being exploited vis-a-vis the prison industrial complex. People who are doing work in prison for pennies on the dollar are creating the space, or are having created for them the space where that same labor that would be done outside of the prison and is not. We saw the California fires a few years ago, where, to juxtapose that to Katrina, white homes were on fire in California. Wealth was at stake, the economic well-being and the social comfort of a middle class and upper middle class and even wealthy cadre of people was at stake. And suddenly prisoners who were incarcerated, these are the same people who were called the dregs of society, the same people who were marked as violent, the same people who were irredeemable, the same people who were untrainable, ineducable, the same people who didn't have access to educational programs in prison, who couldn't get training in prison, were taken out of prison and allowed to put those fires out. Of course, when they get out of prison, because of their criminal record, they can't become firefighters, right? So this is all part of, but there's a kind of collective investment in this kind of landscape, in this kind of reality, and the question is, why will we want to sustain that? But it ain't just white folk at this moment. We all have a kind of collective investment in believing somehow that mass incarceration serves a good for all of us. It allows us to kind of close ranks around not being a criminal class. It allows us to kind of close ranks around not being them. It allows us as a middle class group of people who are black, brown, white, red, or yellow to say we are not them and we do not have those problems. The kind of Faustian bargain that emerges out of the 1950s and 1960s, where we were able to access certain civil rights advances. We were able to access certain kinds of social goods. We were to access for the first time perhaps Harvard and Yale and all those places that we think we want to be. And then we get there, and at the very same time, the poor became disposable. They became the fodder for the prison crisis. They became the vehicle to replicate the economic exploitation of that slave industry. And so while we have to think about the way in which race plays into this, we have to think about the way in which we all have collectively kind of turned a blind eye to a criminal crisis, to a criminalizing crisis through the prison industrial complex. So I want us to think about that and have a kind of sense of history around that. I want us to have a sense of history about how we got here. Because I always remember when Professor Davis talked about the 1960s and the mass incarceration of 200,000 or 300,000 people. And I remember hearing her say, you know, at that moment we saw it as a profound crisis. I mean, how could a nation state lock up 200,000 or 300,000 of its own citizens? I mean, it's an absolute crisis, and yet we've managed to increase the prison population tenfold. We've managed to increase a prison population tenfold. And the simple answer, which is often what we like to engage in, is that we've simply raised a generation of criminals. That we've raised a generation of just irredeemable, recalcitrant people who just do bad things. We've raised a generation of drug addicts. We've raised a generation of thieves. We've raised a generation of people who simply don't follow the law. And as such, the prison industrial complex has expanded to the place where it is right now, where we're looking at, 2.5 million? 1 in 100 American adult citizens incarcerated? I mean, 1 in 100? I mean, the numbers are mind-boggling. 5% of the world's population, 25% of the prison population? I mean, and this isn't like a first world thing. I mean, you go to Germany, you go to Ireland, you add them up, we got more. You go to France, you go to Canada, you go to Italy, we got more. I'm talking about add it all up. You go to the so-called axis of evil, you go to the so-called third world nations, the global south. You go to Cuba, you go to Venezuela, you go to Iraq, you go to Iran, you go to Afghanistan. Add them all up, we have more. So how do you get to that moment historically? I think a sense of history forces us to not just look at the way in which incarceration has happened, it forces us to look at the way that transcarceration has happened. Transcarceration means that we're moving from one form of captivity to another, one form of institutionalization to another. The primary mechanism of transcarceration for the prison population occurs in the 1980s, when we begin to see people who were once housed in mental institutions suddenly on the street. One of the things that Governor Reagan managed to do, and then President Reagan managed to do, was criminalize mental illness. How do you criminalize mental illness? Well, you take people who are in mental institutions and you strip away funding. I'm gonna get to the war on youth in 1 second, because this is all connected. But you take away community funding for community-based mental health organizations. You strip away the funding for mental hospitals. You strip away funding for resources. And so suddenly people who were once mentally ill in hospitals getting treatment and care as they should are now where? On the street. Now that would be bad enough. But then we criminalized being on the street. So you take away mental illness as a space, or as a reason, as a predicate for sort of housing and investing in people medically and socially, and then you put them on the street. And then throughout the 80s and 90s, we saw a rise of state-level laws that did what? They criminalized homelessness. All of a sudden, the Giulianis of the world in the 90s did the very same thing happened in the 80s and 90s, where they began to say, we have to clean up our cities, so we'll make anti-loitering laws, anti-trespassing laws, anti-vagrancy laws, anti-littering laws, anti-panhandling laws. We intensified our penalties for things like public drunkenness and public urination, stuff that on its face might seem reasonable. I mean, who wants public urination, right? Who wants public drunkenness? On its face, it seems like a good thing, but what we've done is essentially criminalize homelessness. So now people who were once mentally ill are now on the street, and being on the street is now illegal. And at the very same time, the people who are on the street, not getting mental health care, are now looking for ways to medicalize their pain, medicalize very real psychological trauma. And coincidentally, at the very same moment that people are criminalized, put on the street, rendered homeless, have a mental illness, we then see the rush of crack on those very streets. And so now people are on the street with crack, and they're homeless, and it's illegal to be homeless, and it's illegal to have crack, and it's illegal to have cocaine, but it's extra illegal to have crack. And then we make it common sense for crack to be extra illegal by creating the narrative of the crack monster and instant addiction and crack mothers and crack babies. Not to say that stuff isn't somewhat true, but every medical study suggests that it's no more true for crack than for powder. And so we create an entire intellectual arm to legitimize criminalizing the poor, criminalizing the homeless, criminalizing the mental illness. And then we prosecute a war on drugs, which by any measure of a war, and the United States is great at having these wars, or calling them wars, because we love the language of war, right? So anytime we have a domestic policy, we call it a war, you know what I mean? So we prosecute a war on drugs, and the war on drugs somehow wasn't a very successful one if you're really warring against drugs, because 40 years later and $1 trillion later, drugs are cheaper, easier to get, and stronger than ever, right? So we lost that war. But what we've actually done is prosecute a different war. In the same way that the war on terror is really a war on civil liberties, the war on drugs becomes a war on small-time drug users. So now we have moved from a social state which invests. There was a time when the welfare state wasn't pejorative, right? So we moved from a social state, we moved away from it. We moved from a medical state, a medicalized state, we moved away from it, where we invested medically in social problems, where we invested socially and economically in social problems. And instead, we've shifted fully toward a penal state, where everything becomes illegal. People don't commit crimes, they commit acts. Acts get criminalized. That's the point. And over the last 40 years, we've created new mechanisms for criminalizing Americans. Poor people, the homeless, the mentally ill, but no group has probably been criminalized more, maybe no subgroup, than young people. And so in the time I have left, I'm just checking my time, I ain't answering the text. Let's see. Well, I turned it off. What time is it? Oh my God, okay. So in the time that I have left, we will, I just want to lay out a few things of how young people are part of this trajectory of criminalizing as opposed to investing. One way is young people in public space. Young people have been criminalized in public space. We have seen over the last 5 to 10 years a rise in public policies that make it illegal literally for young people to occupy public space. Now, this is really important because, and let me make one note here. The freedom to occupy public space has never been fully exercised by black folk. I don't want to paint a nostalgic or romantic notion that black folks somehow were able to occupy public space. I mean, the whole Emmett Till thing, or we could say Trayvon Martin, right? Or we could say the other hundreds of thousands of black bodies that are killed in the street. are proof of that. I'm not suggesting that, that black male bodies or female bodies have ever had full access to it. And black female bodies have been particularly troubled in public space. I mean, the corner has been a place for black men. Ain't never been a place for black women, right? So I don't mean to suggest a nostalgic narrative, but nevertheless, over the last, really, I said 10 years, but really over the last 30 years, we've seen public policies that avoid that. We saw, again, the anti-loitering laws, the anti-gang laws, but we also began to see the rise of civil injunctions against gangs in California, Texas, Illinois, Pennsylvania, New York, Florida. We saw the rise of, we saw civil injunctions against gangs. Essentially what states have done is they've said that we are going to find people who are gang affiliated, gang connected, and make civil injunctions which make it illegal for them to hang together, to be together, to gesture to one another, to occupy public space collectively. Now that might seem troublesome on its face, and it is, but it's further troublesome when you think about how they go about deciding who's gang affiliated. It isn't like, they just walk, like people don't walk around with like gang ID cards, right? They have a kind of investment in figuring out who's in gangs. They use informants, and that's another conversation we can have probably later. But the rise of informants in our neighborhoods and how problematic it is to use informant testimony, snitch testimony as the means of prosecuting cases, because that's the primary mechanism for the war on drugs, is informant testimony. It's not Matlock, right? I'm too old. I'm getting old. That's not a good reference. Right. It's not Law and Order. It's not Scandal. How about that? Right. There we go. At least that's this century. All right. So you see a rise of civil injunctions against gangs, which increases government surveillance and state-level surveillance of young people. Young people are being put on lists. If I have a cousin who is a Crip and I wave to him as he's driving down the street, I can very easily be put on that list. You don't have access to the list. You don't know that you're on the list. No one tells you you're on the list. And so as a result, many of your opportunities, many of your potential job opportunities and schooling opportunities are thwarted because you're on this list. You're under surveillance. And if you happen to fall into the snares of the legal system, your gang affiliation status, which could be simply as something as simple as waving to somebody, can become further evidence of criminal activity. We see the rise of juvenile. Before I say that, you see the rise of stop and frisk. The primary targets of stop and frisk policy, and particularly in New York City and Philadelphia, which have been two of the primary sites of stop and frisk, are young black and brown people. And it purely is, we're going to throw something against the wall and see if it sticks. Because 95% of people who are stopped and frisked have nothing. That's based on law enforcement's numbers. I can only imagine what the real number is. Because if they're conceding that they get it wrong 95% of the time, imagine what it might actually be. But they're saying 95% of the time, people have nothing. There's no probable cause. There's no reason for it, but it creates an environment and a culture where young people are criminalized, where we look at them through the lens of fear and blame and containment rather than investment and support and love. So the civil injunctions against gangs, the stop and frisk policy, then we have these juvenile juvenile curfews. The curfews in Philadelphia, where I'm doing research, in New York, in California, in Detroit, in Chicago, we see the expansion of curfews, sometimes as early as 8 o'clock in the summertime, which literally make it illegal to be young and outside. This is the kind of language that has become common sense for us. We have normalized a culture of seeing young people through the lens of criminality. And then you finally get them to school, which we've imagined or framed in the popular imagination as the kind of space that liberates you from the problems of the world, that is a space where you learn citizenship, a place where you learn education, a place where you are able to experience the great equalizer, the thing that makes America America. And it is the thing that makes, the schools in fact are the things that make America America, because it's the primary mechanism for feeding the market and criminalizing young people. You walk into a school in Detroit, walk into a school in Cleveland, walk into a school in the 9th Ward, go into the 3rd Ward in Houston. You see a line down the street to get into school. Because young people are being prepared for life in a criminal space. It takes you 20 minutes to get into school because as you're walking in, you're walking through an entire infrastructure of surveillance. We have spent more money on metal detectors than in schools than in prisons over the last 5 years. Surveillance cameras everywhere. Random locker searches all the time, even when students don't consent to them. There's many schools in Philadelphia have fingerprint scans now. There are barking dogs, drug dogs. So imagine being a 12-year-old walking into school, and the camera's looking at you. You scan your printer, they search your book bag, they search your locker, the dog's sniffing all around you. There's a parole officer, a probation officer, a school officer, a real police officer. You go through all that, you go through the metal detector. It takes you 20 minutes to get into school, and then when you finally get into school, there's nobody stopping you from leaving. I mean, think about the kind of pedagogy that the built environment of the school offers. All of the money, all of the infrastructure, all of the human capital, all of the personnel is invested in scanning, searching, surveilling, and criminalizing you. And then when you get in, there's very little infrastructure and even saying, hey, why don't you stay? I mean, imagine if that much investment was put in helping you read or helping you, not even hooky school. I mean, just think about it. But the other ways that school criminalizes you is less sort of metaphorical. It's far more literal. What schools have done is mirror the outside environment. The way that you expand criminality is in two ways in school. The first thing they do is they widen the net of criminality in school. They widen the net. What does that mean? It means that there's more stuff you can get in trouble for. A kid last week in Trenton, New Jersey, brought in a Swiss Army knife. Another kid in the middle of the country, I can't remember what state it was in, brought in it was a water gun. Another kid brought in it was actually something used to ice cakes with. But they said it looked too much like a weapon. So there's more stuff you can get in trouble for. We have widened the net of criminality to include more kids. Again, we didn't raise a generation of criminals. We raised a generation of crimes. We produced a generation of new crimes that we wanted to handle. So we stretched the net so more kids fall in. And then we deepened the net. So we widened the net of criminality to have more stuff you can get arrested for. And then we deepened the net. What does deepening the net mean? It means that things that used to happen in schools that were handled by personnel, I'm sure some of y'all got suspended before. And the teacher showed up and they wrote a little note, or we called them pink slips, I had lots of them. And then you went to the principal. And if things got really bad and you did something crazy, so-called, you'd go to the superintendent or they'd do something. Now the police are involved in school level discipline. So they've widened the net, but they've also deepened the net. So that first grade girl in Philadelphia who had a temper tantrum was carried out in handcuffs and arrested for disorderly conduct. Now, the point is not, just to any of my right-wing folk who might have snuck in the room, the point here is not to excuse bad behavior. We are not suggesting that the appropriate response to being told you can't go to recess is to roll on the floor and scream and cry and punch the floor. And if I were to do that right now, you would have perfect reason to think something's wrong with Mark. But at 6, it's developmentally appropriate. Even if we want to correct it. 6-year-olds do have temper tantrums. Most of us did. It's developmentally appropriate even if we want to correct it. The problem is because we often look at black and brown children not as children whose youth is worthy of protecting and preserving, whose innocence is worthy of sustaining, we look at them as short adults, right? I mean, As awful as the tragedies are that have happened around the world, whether it's in Aurora, whether it's in Sandy Hook, these tragedies are awful. But part of why our collective response has been so intense and so efficient and so effective and so assertive is because there is a sense of this shouldn't happen here. What's the girl's name? John Benet Ramsey. Tragic death happened almost 20 years ago, though. Every time there's a slight piece of evidence about that case, it comes back out again because we are obsessed with the life of a child whose innocence was lost. But when it comes to black and brown children, again, from a developmental approach, we don't see them as having the same thing. Even internally, we don't do that sometimes. We call them, that's my little man. That's my man. Right? We frame them as short adults, as people who have somehow surpassed this developmental stage, which thereby makes it easier to criminalize them because they're not children. So it's easier to look at a 6-year-old boy who gets into a fight, and it's easier to look at him and then arrest him, rather than do conflict resolution and a suspension like we did for everyone else for the last 30 years, and it actually hasn't worked out so badly. But we criminalize them, and part of why the criminalization happens is not because people are overtly racist or because people decide I'm going to criminalize all the black boys in school, but because we often have scripts in our minds for who and what these children are. And that becomes part of the problem too. 95% of the disciplinary action that happens in schools around this country, including incarceration, including arrests, including the sending them to zero tolerance schools, which are just holding pens for prison, all of those spaces, I mean, they really are. In fact, many of the people who invest in zero tolerance schools like CEP, Community Education Partners, have investments in privatized prisons. This is an actual fact. But many of those people, when you look at how they're criminalized, let me back up for one second, and then I know we gotta go. I got about 5 minutes, right? I'm using your watch, Professor Davis. I saw her 5 minutes earlier. But when we send them to these places and we decide to send them to these outposts, when we decide to suspend them, when we call police in, it's not based on a concrete rule. Like, they'd like to have you think kids are bringing guns to schools and they're shooting. That actually rarely happens, quite frankly, particularly in black and brown neighborhoods. It actually rarely happens. The incidents are more extreme when they do happen, but they actually don't happen more than they did even 20 years ago. But when they make the decision, 95% of the times where teachers and school-level personnel bring in law enforcement, when they make disciplinary action, it's not based on a concrete violation of a rule, like I brought in a gun or I assaulted a teacher. It's based on what Russell Skibber calls disciplinary moments, where I have to make a subjective interpretation of your behavior. I have to decide if you're being overly aggressive. I have to decide if you're being disrespectful. I have to decide if you're a threat to public safety. And the problem with that is black bodies, even when they're unarmed, standing still, holding Skittles, and maybe a hoodie, are read as dangerous. So this isn't just a matter of saying, well, if you don't break the law, you ain't got nothing to worry about. It isn't just a matter of saying, well, just don't have a temper tantrum and you're okay. It's actually not enough. Because there's this last piece, and then I'll leave y'all alone. It's about targeting. It's about targeting. Where are we looking? 80% of New York prisoners come from 3 counties. From 3 counties. Ain't Westchester. I mean, it's fascinating to see. And you could say, well, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's something wrong. It could mean that those 3 counties are high crime. It could mean that lots of people commit crimes. The problem is it's not true. Drug use is the same across the board. Intimate partner violence, same across the board. Even sexual assault, as tragic as it is, the same across the board. Yet we're only looking for, I teach at Columbia University. If I were to conduct a raid on Friday night, I could only imagine how many people I could arrest for public drunkenness, disorderly conduct, simple possession of marijuana. Most of them, you know. Faculty too, you know. Don't check my drawer, you know. But we're not looking there. And I'm not suggesting that we should look there. My point isn't that we should start to look there. My point is that we should do a few things. We should reimagine crime. We should reimagine what criminality is. We have to divest ourselves from this belief that there is a criminal class that exists outside of us. We have to strip away some of the moral attachments we have to these so-called victimless crimes. Like, we've convinced ourselves that crack smokers aren't just drug addicts, that they're actually bad people. That there's something morally wrong with smoking crack. Now, let me give you some of y'all caution. I'm not suggesting that you smoke crack, right? Let me be very clear. I think you should not smoke crack. But we've attached a kind of moral skittishness to crack smoking, to sex work, that we think that they're bad people, and therefore when they become incarcerated, it becomes much easier to stomach the incarceration of a crack addict as opposed to a CEO on Wall Street who's not only stealing their money but maybe doing cocaine in his office, right? In our mind, he's a weird guy and he's a character and maybe he has some ethical issues, but he doesn't belong in prison. That's sort of how we think about it. Ironically, they're committing crimes that are far more intense, far more vicious, and far more widespread than somebody who's smoking crack in their basement and trying to find a job and unable to access mental health. So we have to strip away our own kind of, this sort of weird morality we have when we decide that certain people are a criminal class. We need to move away from thinking about, and Professor Davis talked about this, we have to find a way to move away from thinking about punishment. We have to stop thinking about containment as the only way to think about punishment. And we have to stop thinking about punishment as the only way to respond to social problems. I mean, that at the core, we have to reimagine this. I mean, the thing that changed me was the critical resistance movement. The thing that changed me was reading Are Prisons Obsolete? The thing that changed me was studying the work of Mumia Abu-Jamal. And all of them convinced me that we could, in fact, imagine a world without prisons. That we could actually imagine a world without prisons. And I know that's hard. It's nearly impossible to imagine. I mean, someone once said it's easier to imagine the end to the world itself than to imagine the end of capitalism, right? It is, I would argue that in this moment, it is almost equally easy to imagine the end to a world itself than to imagine the end of prisons. But we have to. We have to actually imagine a world that invests. We have to actually imagine a world that is committed to two things: decarceration and excarceration. Decarceration is the exact opposite of what's happening now. We have to find ways to literally empty out these cells. We have to find ways of putting people back on the street, of getting people home again. Whether it's suspended sentences, whether it's community-based judgments, whether it's restitution, we have to find ways of getting people home. And the thing is, based on criminological evidence, when people don't go to jail and they stay home, crime doesn't go up. See, they'd like you to believe that somehow crime is moving up and down based on our incarceration numbers. As we're building these prisons and incarcerating more people, crime's not going down. And the building of the prisons wasn't a response to crime going up. So let's take crime out of it for a minute, not because we like crime, but because crime ain't on the table. We have to find a way to keep people home. We have to also then think about excarceration. We have to actually reimagine the role, purpose, and function of prisons. We have to actually find ways of decriminalizing behaviors, like drugs. I would argue like prostitution. Right? I would argue sex work, as dangerous as sex work is, as concerned as I am with sex trafficking, I'm not sure that we address the fundamental core issue related to the violence of that industry by criminalizing them. I don't see it. We have to imagine the world that is not yet. How do we do it? That's the million-dollar question, right? You have to organize. You have to organize. You have to organize. We have 1,000 people here today, and they will come and they'll hear speeches and they'll go to awesome workshops and they will leave feeling good. The question becomes, what do we do tomorrow? I've been an activist since I was 15 years old. I joined my first organization when I was 15 and a half. And I've been doing this for a while, and I've been fighting in the drug policy reform movement for a while, anti-prison movement for a long time, the Free Mumia campaign since I can remember. And the thing that I always found challenging was the day after. It's always the day after. As crazy as I could get people to get arrested. You can actually get people to get arrested. You can get people to stage walkouts. You can get people to even get beaten by police. Nobody likes it. But you can get people to come to the spectacle. But the real work is the day after. The day after 500 of us get arrested and come home, there are 5 of us trying to make flyers. 5 of us doing political education. You know what I mean? There are 5 of us doing the work that is necessary to move a movement forward. Beyond the spectacle, when we leave here today, let us make a commitment to joining an organization and working with an organization. Notice I didn't say start one. I'm not saying that there's not a need to start organizations. Sometimes there are needs that need to be filled through new organizations, but so often I go to campuses and I meet students and they want to start an organization and I say, why? And they say, I don't know. I mean, it's fascinating. Every campus I go to, I want to start a nonprofit. Really? On what? I don't know. I just know I want to run one. That can't be the model. That can't be the model. I go to campuses where there'll be 50 black people and there'll be 25 organizations. Everybody's president and vice president. That ain't about the organization. That ain't about the movement. That ain't about justice. That's about y'all. At some point, we have to come together and build an organization, fortify an already existing organization, support organizations that are about justice. That means we have to do the work even when we're not in front, even when we don't get the microphone, even when we don't get seen, because there are people who need us. And the last thing I'll tell you, and never, ever, ever lose sight of the fact that this work matters. We fought, Mumia Abu-Jamal was locked up in 1981, and he's been on death row since 1981. He just got off death row in December of 2011. It took 30 years of struggle. And there were many moments where people who worked much harder than I did, people who were much more even focused, and I mean, you look at the Pam Africas of the world. I could go down a list of folk who have struggled on behalf of Mumia. And there were moments where we thought there was no way we could win. There were moments where we thought that there was no way that we could succeed. Decades went by where there was no foreseeable progress, and yet we continued to fight. People continued to struggle and sacrifice, and now he's not home, but he's off of death row. And there are some idealists in the movement who would say that that's not good enough, that we still haven't won anything. And I remember the day Mumia got off death row. And many of us celebrated. Many of us cried. And someone raised their hand in a meeting we were having at the committee and said, I don't know why y'all are celebrating. This is not a victory. He's not home yet. There's nothing to celebrate about. This is a concession. We shouldn't even accept this. I started to feel bad about myself. I went to see Mumia about 60 days later. Mind you, he hasn't had a contact visit in 30 years. I didn't go see him first. His wife saw him first. Pam Africa saw him first. His lawyer saw him first. I met with him that following weekend. And I told him what the woman said. I said, they said this is not a victory. The work we're doing on the ground to end prisons, to free you, to get you home is not a victory because it's not a complete victory. We shouldn't celebrate incomplete victories. You know what he said to me? He said, shit. If y'all know me, you know, he's like, shit. He said, anybody that say being off death row ain't a victory ain't never been on death row. We can't stop there. We can't stop at a moment where he is just on death row. We got to keep fighting. We've had a dip in incarceration, yes, but we have to fight so that criminalization doesn't keep happening. We have to fight to create a world that is more fair, more just. We can't stop here. Even if we have a partial victory in the last week or two, we can't stop there. Even though the Rockefeller drug laws are being dismantled in New York, we can't stop there. But we still must support ourselves and honor this tradition by saying, look, we are doing good work. What we do matters every day. And the work we're doing makes the world better. And even at our most cynical, it at least stops it from being worse. We have to keep doing this work. We have to keep struggling and organizing and fighting. It's not our option. It is our responsibility. When Angela Davis was facing the death chamber, James Baldwin wrote this amazing letter in November of 1970, and he said, those of us who know the truth and do nothing are worse than the murderers hired in our name. He said, those of us who know the truth, he said we must fight for your life as if it were our own, which it is, and render impassable with our bodies the corridor to the gas chamber. Because if they come for you in the morning, they will come for us that night. The fight to end mass incarceration isn't just a fight to free the 2.5 million bodies in cage, although it is about them. It is also about creating a world that is more fair and more just and more human and more livable for everybody, whether you're fighting for gay and lesbian rights, whether you're fighting for the environment, whether you're fighting for economic justice. All of this intersects because none of us are free if anyone is unfree. And so we have to continue to beat up unfreedom, battle injustice, create a new sense of democracy, and end the prison industrial complex right now. Free Mumia.
If you could just bear with us for a minute, we're going to move to the panel opportunity so that we can field some questions from the audience for Dr. Davis and Dr. Hill. Another round of applause for Dr. Marc Lamont Hill, please. I also want to mention that Sarah Walker is presenting in the boardroom from Radical Prison Movement to Interest Group Advocacy, Criminal Justice. And Michelle Garnett McKenzie is presenting Immigration Detention in America. And that is in the Heritage Room. Both those rooms are in the same hallway as where the cafeteria is. Ready? Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, right. Consider it bothering them.
You, yeah, I guess so.
Are we ready? Are the mics on? So can I move you two to the stage? Hey, Alex.
Honestly,
I'll take that. Mark, can you get rid of this for me? Thank you, sir. What do you need? Bring you both up stage. Well, we're going to get Brother Hill, Sister Davis on stage, please. About 35 minutes. So I promised a young man earlier who wanted to ask in the cafeteria, in the chapel, a question. So I want to present him with the first opportunity here.
Hello, everybody. I'm Abdi from Minneapolis, St. Catherine University. So I'm a news junkie, so this question always comes up. As far as federal prosecutors having relentless power as far as just indicting anybody, as far as immigrants or just placing them in detention halls. Is there any way that we can strip these guys of their powers as far as, anything? Or it just feels like they can come through any neighborhood and say, you're an illegal immigrant. We're going to put you away for so many years. You have no voice, no power. You're illegal. So who's going to fight for you? Who's doing it is the United States prosecutors. Is there anything that we can do or say?
Well, I'll try to answer your question by pointing out that the defense of immigrant rights is one of the major civil rights movements of this century. And all of us should be involved in immigrant rights issues. One of the reasons why federal prosecutors are able to engage in that kind of behavior is because they think they can do it with impunity. And so if they were to see, you remember, when was that? The May Day marches that happened some years ago where there were 1 million people marching on May 1st. In defense of immigrant rights. Now, the majority of those people who participated in those demonstrations came from communities where immigrants are most visible, or communities of people who look like they might be immigrants. And we didn't have nearly as much Black participation, African American participation as we should have, nearly as much participation from progressive white communities. So I think that that one of the ways to end that would be to build a vast movement, not simply in favor of the DREAM Act. The DREAM Act is considered a really big deal, but actually it is so minor. We shouldn't even have to talk about the fact that young people who have been in school and are getting an education should have some kind of path towards citizenship. We should acknowledge that immigrants are doing the labor that makes this country work, that fuels the economy. And as a matter of fact, African Americans should acknowledge that immigrants today are doing the work that Black people used to do in this country. So I think that developing a broader consciousness about the centrality of immigrant rights and the need to challenge xenophobia, especially Islamophobia, which continues to drive the so-called war on terrorism, which is not a war on terrorism, as Mark pointed out, but it's a war on people. So my suggestion is that we strengthen our movements, which will probably be my answer to a lot of questions.
All right, we have another question over here.
Hi, I'm Jackie Christensen, Gustavus class of '86, mother of Alex Christensen, class of '13. I wonder if both of you could comment on your thoughts of the effects of the entertainment industry, especially Hollywood and TV, on perpetuating a lot of the stereotypes.
I'm always reluctant to locate my critique there, not because there isn't one to be brought to bear on them, but I'm always interested in the more fundamental structural issues, that make incarceration happen, that make mass poverty happen. I think we normalize a culture of violence through media, for sure. I think we normalize incarceration. I think we normalize rape. I think we normalize a lot of things through the entertainment industry, through Hollywood, through images, through music. I think, though, that oftentimes we prosecute our wars in such narrow fashion that we decide that Hollywood, we have the sort of generational moral panic and say that this music or this book or this culture is destroying our young people, when in fact it's probably far more important. For example, if I'm looking at violence in Chicago, yeah, I could look at a rap video, right? And I should, right? Because if violence against black bodies is normalized in those videos, and that's something we should consider as a culture. But I don't think that critique come at the expense of a more substantive critique of how guns get into the country and who's profiting off those guns. And it shouldn't come at the expense of I mean, even as the jobs numbers came out on Friday, jobs report that said that we had a decline in unemployment, and it went from like 7.9 to 7.7. I mean, it wasn't anything remarkable. For black youth between the ages of I think 19 and 24, unemployment was still like 24%. So when I'm looking at crime in Chicago, yeah, I could look at the latest Gucci Mane video, right? Or I could look at the fact that people ain't got jobs, and there's guns, and there's drugs, right? None of which are on a wide scale produced by us. At the same time that there's a crumbling school system. So people don't even have spaces of protection anymore. So you know what I mean? So all of that to me is far more influential, far more important than the entertainment piece of it, at the same time that I think we should be critiquing entertainment. One more piece of this, and I think this is perhaps, since we've been talking about mass incarceration, one of the biggest problems, and it's one of the things that I do attribute largely to pop culture, again, among other things, is sexual violence in prison. We have normalized the idea that men go to prison and get raped. I mean, it's like mainstream TV shows have rape jokes about prison. I mean, whether it's a Tyler Perry movie, whether it's a TV show, there's this culture of just joking about men going to prison and needing to protect themselves from rape. So we've normalized a culture of rape. I mean, that's mind-boggling to me. And so that's one example where I think we could push back. That's one example where I could say, popular culture has really helped to normalize it. But again, we live in a rape culture. I mean, it isn't just pop culture. I mean, there's a whole, there's a broader thing around this. But I think that's one instance. But in general, I think we have to look at core issues. No, I know you didn't. I'm just telling you that's my reluctance. Yeah, right.
Well, let me also say that our ideas about the nature of imprisonment come largely from the media. If you look at the degree to which television and films are saturated with images of prisons, it makes us feel as if we know what this institution is all about, and we don't really. And it makes us that much more likely to assent to a process of mass incarceration. So I think, sometimes we don't even think critically about these programs with which we engage. Just as you acquire a certain kind of literacy here, you learn how to read books and explicate texts and all of that. You have to learn how to read media. You have to learn how to interact critically with TV and films, as opposed to simply absorbing it and assuming that this is the way things are. There's a story I'll just tell. A friend of mine some years ago, who was an attorney for a women's anti-prison organization, said that she was defending a young woman in prison, and she was talking to the prosecutor and trying to get the prosecutor to be a little less strict in what she was proposing. And the woman who was the prosecutor said, after she had told her about the particular situation in Ad Seg for this woman, and she said, "You don't have to tell me." The prosecutor says, "You don't have to tell me what prisons are like in this country. I watch television." She just said it like that. So that was really scary. So it means that we have to acquire the ability to interact a little bit more critically with these images that saturate our lives.
Okay, so my name is Zaide. I'm a corrections major, and I'm actually just got a job at Waseca Penitentiary for Women. But I was just there visiting at Waseca Federal Prison and Faribault Federal Prison for Men, and I was asking what the pay rates were, and they were getting paid 50 cents, and then like a phone call was like $70. And then I was asking what the labor was, and they were making like all the material like needed for tanks or like uniforms for the military. So I was going to ask you guys, do you guys think, and then in the 13th Amendment, when it was abolished, it cut off all slavery except for in prison, so the use of punishment. So do you guys think this is like the main focus of punishment instead of deterrence? Like, what was I going to say? Is this a discrete way of society keeping slavery ongoing?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes, right? Absolutely. And not just slavery for its own sake, but slavery for economic exploitation. I mean, that's the point, right? It's about capital. Every time I go, my brother just came home from prison a year or two ago, and I would go to visit him. And one time I came in the middle of a guard shift, and so I had to watch. It takes like an hour for all the guards to pass through, and they were talking, and he was out near Pittsburgh, and it was a small town, and I was talking to the guard, and they were all talking. They all seemed to know each other. I said to him, you all seem like you know each other. And he said, yeah. We said we all live here, And the town only had about maybe 6,000 people in it, right? And there had to be at least 200, 300 correctional officers. So I'm like, okay, so a big chunk of this town's employment comes from being a correctional officer. Then when you add the people who are clergy, when you add the people who do contract work, electrical work, food services work, people who work in the cafeteria, I mean, suddenly there's a big chunk of the prison, or a big chunk of the town in the prison. You take 3,000 people from Chester, PA, North Philadelphia, West Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, you throw them in there, now the town's population goes from 5,000 to 8,000. So now they're getting more roads, more schools, because they have a higher residency. So now the town has more money, the town has better roads, town might even get more congressional representation if they keep locking up people, right? So their entire investment is in locking people up. And then when you add these other things, I mean, prison phone calls is the latest. I mean, the phone industry in prison is one of the biggest sites of exploitation. People are literally, like you said, paying $40 and $50 for phone calls. You know what I mean? They block all other mechanisms of doing it. And people say, well, you don't do the crime, you don't do the time. If you can't do the crime, whatever that stupid thing people say. And the truth is, this has a material impact not just on criminals, but on their families. It tears apart families, it tears apart children. It makes it impossible for people to connect. And it's a reminder that prison is not about rehabilitation, but it really is about punishment. Because there's nothing reasonable about that. Yeah.
Dr. Angela Davis, I am in such awe and so happy to be here in your presence. Dr. Hill, I was not familiar with you at all. I'll never forget you now after your speech. It was absolutely wonderful. My question is, a lot of the things that you guys said really resonated with me. More than 25 years ago, I was convicted of a felony. And I have always worked in corporate America, never had an issue. About 8 years ago, I was laid off. They are now doing mass background checks. And I have been caught up in that. I had a really, really hard time finding another job because of my criminal background, even though it was 25 years ago. I noticed that on an application, it says, have you ever been convicted of a crime? Not within the past 7 years or within the past 10 years. What can be done, and I don't know if it's on a legislative level, if it's working with corporations, what can I do, as you say, Dr. Hill, tomorrow to kind of relieve this issue of have you ever been convicted? How long do you pay for a crime?
Well, there are organizations that are addressing what Marc Mauer called the collateral consequences of crime. And there's an organization that's actually headquartered in San Francisco, but it has a national reach, and it's called All of Us or None. And one of their major campaigns is to get rid of the box, right? The theater group informed us about the box, right? It's, I mean, the point that you make, it's such a contradiction that originally prisons were supposed to be places of rehabilitation. Of course, they never were. But the point is you pay for the rest of your life, and that is the theme of this conference, right? Sentence for life. You pay for the rest of your life. All of Us or None is an organization of former felons. All of them who, and some of the people who are in the leadership of that organization are absolutely amazing. Dorsey Nunn, for example. So I would urge you to check out All of Us or None on the web, and there might be some formation in Minnesota, but I don't think there is. Justice for All. There you go. See, this is actually a really good place to do that kind of networking. So who said that? Okay. Okay. So you what's your name? Angela. Oh well. Angela. What's your name? Nicole. Soul. Okay. Angela and Soul. You should get together immediately after this. Okay. You see? Never try to do this kind of work by yourself. If you do, you will get burnt out, and you will never learn what it means to participate in the creation of a real community, a community of struggle. And that's the only way we can hope to win victories. Partial victories, and then, hopefully, well, I don't know whether we'll ever win a full victory. We'll always be struggling for partial victories, because every time we win one victory, we discover that there's a lot more we have to deal with, right?
All right. Hi, my name's Ian Taylor. I'm a sophomore at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. I just want to thank you guys again for coming, and I really want to work to help educate people about mass incarceration and also encourage action. You guys are both activists and educators, so I want to ask, what's the best way to pursue that? How can we encourage people, a wide, diverse amount of people, to know about mass incarceration and also act against it? Thank you.
That's a good question, Ian. There's so many ways. I mean, it's funny, we were talking at lunch about the internet, and I was sort of saying some of my reluctance to engage social media from an activist perspective, because I feel like people get locked there. And some of the things I loved most was knowing the people I'm struggling with, seeing them, being in their physical space. Then there's pragmatic issues around being in people's physical space as well as an activist. But that said, I think one of the things you all can do is use the tools of your generation. Giving out flyers. We used to put flyers everywhere, and it just doesn't work. And I work with organizations now that's still like going out, like having events and like giving out flyers, and they're posting them. People don't read flyers, right? But they're at least not in the same way, right? So one of the things I would say is, if you're trying to spread the word, if you have a message, if there's a type of political education, don't be afraid to use the tools that you have. For example, YouTube. I mean, there are videos that get as much as I didn't like the Coney 2012 movement for all its problematic representations of Africa, and we could talk about all kinds of reasons why it was problematic, 96 million people watched it. Right? Imagine if we could produce something that provided political education around this prison issue, right? Even if it's just something as simple as the box, right? Something that we could all kind of wrap our minds around and say, somebody who was in prison, 35 years ago and has been working a job like the Chicago railroad workers who got fired 5 years ago after working without incident on a job for 25 years because they decided to do a background check right after 9/11. We can put a spotlight on that. And we can use YouTube and Twitter and Facebook to organize around that. Think about what we did in Jena, Louisiana. I mean, there are all these moments where digital media became as you said, the mobilizing tool, right? So I think that's one thing you can do, but don't lose sight. And this is the part that I have to say, do not lose sight of the importance of physically leaving your laptop and going into communities where people are and working with them on their behalf, and also going into your own communities and organizing them. I think there was nothing more frustrating from an activist perspective, from a community perspective, than having activists from other communities come in and organize them. It's like, well, why don't you go back and organize, your folk? Because oftentimes those are the ones who are endorsing these policies. So there's that piece of it too. So encourage people to organize in communities, organize on the ground, and reach people at the age. You'd be surprised how much work you can do at a young age. I work with the Philadelphia Student Union, and the Philadelphia Student Union is an organization of students in high school right now who are organizing around educational issues. They've been doing it for 10 years. They have 10 branches in the Philadelphia schools. They're the ones leading. They're leading marches. They're leading walkouts. They're going to the state capitol protesting for the budget cuts. There's a major budget cut in Pennsylvania at the time that they hiked the prison budget. They fought, they organized, and we gave them tools. So part of what it's about is providing that capacity to young people. So don't just organize people your age and older, go to the young people, go to the high schools, but use the tools at your disposal. Don't just use Instagram and take pictures of your food. You know what I mean? That's most of what y'all do. Use Instagram, use Facebook, use Twitter, use YouTube to mobilize people, to organize people, and then actually hit the ground running.
Yeah, let me just add something to that. I'm really excited about all of the interest in mass imprisonment today. I've been doing this work, I told you, virtually all of my life. And I can remember in the 90s, the mid-90s, when I would suggest, when someone asked me to speak on a college campus, university campus somewhere, I would suggest that perhaps I should speak on something related to prisons. And oftentimes the response was, that is not an appropriate topic. Seriously. And people then did not even want to talk about what was going on. This is right after the 80s when you began to experience this massive upsurge in numbers of people in prison. You mentioned prisoners, and people immediately thought about crime. So it was all about crime. This is one of the reasons why in Critical Resistance we decided to try to popularize the term prison industrial complex so that people would begin to think about this, not just in terms of, if we support prisoners, then they're going to come out and attack us. And I'm actually, quite amazed that within a relatively short historical period, people have demonstrated so much interest in the topic of mass incarceration and the prison industrial complex. I say that because I think it's really important to take advantage of this right now, because you don't know when it's going to slip away, and especially given the work that the right-wingers have been attempting to do, and the rise of neoliberal ideology. You have to use this moment. So I think that everyone, regardless of what kind of work you do, whether you're students, you can help to build this consciousness. You can help to broaden the movement. And you don't have to do anything other than what you're doing right now. But talk to people in your classes, in your churches or synagogues, or in your trade unions, and make sure that everybody is aware of this crisis. And also, and I'll say this because the whole history of the prison in this country has been a history of pendulum shifts from reform and rehabilitation to incapacitation and immobilization. And we're in a period now where people are talking about the crisis and wanting to do something about it. But this institution has this amazing ability to absorb critique and to use the critique to become a stronger and more effective and broader system of surveillance and punishment. So we have to be careful now, because if we might end up 20 years from now with not only we might end up with a smaller prison system, but as Mark was, can I call you Mark? As Mark was, I know he kept calling me Professor Davis. I said, why don't you just say Angela? But anyway, we might end up with the net being cast far wider than it is today. The uses of surveillance and carceral technology in our daily lives, and we might think things are better, but as a matter of fact, they're a lot worse. So take advantage right now of this moment.
Next question is over here. We have about 10 more minutes or so. I'm not going to get to everybody in the room, but I will try to get to as many people as I can.
How you doing, Mark? I'm here with my group and our mentor. We represent the Power People Leadership Institute for Development. And I asked this question of Sister Davis earlier. My question for you is, what would you say is a feasible alternative for prison? Because a lot of times, and I'm directly involved with the prison industrial complex. I was in there, so I know what it's all about. Not a fan at all. But when you talk and ask people, okay, well, what do you want to do, and for an opposition of this? There's a big gray area, and it's like, okay, well, we can have fundraisers, we can do that, and that has proven to be ineffective. So I ask you, what would you say? I think I got some very good feedback from Ms.
You said
Davis.
the alternative to prison?
Yes, absolutely.
That is the million-dollar question when you're an abolitionist, right? And it's a reasonable question. But again, I think we have to sort of release our imaginations a bit and not think of everybody in prison as a criminal, right? So again, that's why I think excarceration is so important, right? If we reimagine who's in there, and we said, well, this war on drugs has led to, like 80% of these people are drug related, right? So what does a decriminalization of marijuana do to that prison population? So what does and I'm not convinced that that all drugs should be legalized. I'm not convinced of that. I'd have to think through that more. Not at this moment in history. As an abstract idea, I'm with it. I worry about what would happen if we legalize heroin tomorrow in our community, given the way our communities are preyed upon by corporate interests. It's more about, but anyway, that's another topic. My point is, I wonder what decriminalization of drugs would do, right? That would whittle down the population, right? If we took people who were small-time drug users, people who call it a crack rock or two in their bag, and we thought about treatment and care as opposed to incarceration, what would that do to the prison population? Now that 2.5 million might be down to 1 million. If we just properly address the so-called war on drugs through treatment and care, I suspect we could get the prison population under 1 million. We could, if we looked at mental illness, mental health issues, we could probably shrink it more if we looked at mental health facilities. And then some of y'all are like, yeah, that all sounds good, but I got a cousin. And I mean, when Richard Pryor said, I didn't like prison, so I went to one. I saw some people in there who was so crazy. I was like, yo, thank God for prison, right? But that can't be the template for how we think about prisons. Yes, there are people who are a danger to society. Yes, we all know that person in our neighborhood, somebody who related to us, somebody on our block who did something that's unthinkable, and we just can't imagine giving them treatment and care. We can't imagine a slap on the wrist. We can't imagine suspended sentence. That might be true. There are people, for example, there are child molesters. There are serial rapists. There are mass murderers. We could look at those folk and say, okay, all that drug stuff is good. I'm willing to release them. I'm willing to do treatment and care for them, but there's 500,000 people who need this. I would argue that I can't imagine someone there's no way for me to imagine serial rape or mass murders outside the context of mental health. Like, I'm not saying that there shouldn't be some form of forced confinement for some folk who may be dangerous to themselves and to society. But I think the bulk of people don't fit into that box. And for those that do, I think we have to do something different. And Angela was talking about this earlier, something different than just putting them in a cage and thinking that we're going to get rid of rape and molestation because these rapists and child molesters are in a cage. There has to be an element of treatment and care for them too. There has to be something to get at the core of why this is happening. And that might happen in a secure treatment facility, but it won't happen in the modern prison. So even we have to even think about secure confinement outside the context of the prison. I'm not saying that you should do outpatient, mental health services for someone who's killed 10 people. They might need some kind of secure confinement, but not the prison. That doesn't do anything. That doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't cure them. And unless we're rendering them disposable as well, which I don't think we should, then we don't have that issue. So I have to say excarceration all day, find ways to decriminalize, find ways to get rid of these victimless crimes. And also long term, and this is long term, we have to invest. Because if you invest in the things that, what's most frustrating for me, and I'll stop, I know we got to run out of time, is that we know what works. Early childhood education works. Early literacy works. Public libraries work. Health facilities work. Housing work. I mean, there's so many things that we know lead to decarceration, that lead people off the pathway to prison. We know in prison, recidivism is reduced when people have access to education, in prison libraries, in books, in grants, Pell Grants for learning. And yet we strip all of it away. If we just did what works, we would also shrink that number. So I think the bulk of the problem is not what do we do with these crazy people who can't be allowed in society. I think that's the wrong, and I know you're not asking that, but that's, I think, the often way people are thinking about it. I think that's the wrong way to frame it.
You haven't had any questions over here. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Davis and Dr. Hill, for being here. I would just like to say that, Dr. Davis, it's because of you that some of us on my campus, I'm from Hamlin University, organized last year and really started to do something about the things that we saw as problematic on our campus, such as financial aid and stuff. So thank you. And my question goes to Dr. Hill. Earlier you were talking about how, it's easy to, relatively easy to get people to organize around something right away and to, do sit-ins and get arrested, right, and to act right away, right? But you also talked about how the hardest part is actually the next day. What do you do after that? And we are finding the same struggles with our movement on campus, is that, after we did our protests and everything, and then suddenly the only people who are still standing are the few of us who started it in the first place. And so how do we keep people motivated after the big rallies and stuff like that, so that they know that these issues, there are still issues to be talked about?
I'm going to answer this real quick, and I would like to hear what Angela has to say about this too. Two things. One, I manage my expectations. I don't necessarily need 500 people organizing. I used to think that to organize you needed all these people. And that's somewhat ahistorical, right? I mean, like very small percentage of black folk march for civil rights. It's like 12% or something like that. We sort of imagine that everybody was marching and fighting and getting bit by dogs and sprayed by water. It's just not true. It's usually a small number of people that do it. I remember Fidel said, I think he said I did revolution with 30 men. If I could do it again, I would do it with 7 who had absolute faith. To some extent, that's how I feel now. I would rather organize with a small number of people who are committed and willing to sacrifice. But to the extent that I do want to organize people and get people together, I try to speak to their needs. I think sometimes we come in from on high, we tell people what the problems are, what the issues are, and then we say, well, they're not on board with it. But maybe there's a way on a campus to connect the issues that we care about, like say mass incarceration, to the issues they're trying to figure out, like how do I pay for my tuition next year as the university is becoming more corporatized and raising its tuition. And there might be some connection between those two things that we're not even thinking about, but we have to actually listen to the people and find out where they are and have a struggle with them, not on their behalf. We can't represent them. We have to represent with them.
My question, you spoke, Dr. Hill, about a trend of identity, both in the white working class back in the Reconstruction era, how they wanted to be ranked in and organize their identity as, I'm better than the black folk, the slaves. At least we're not freed slaves. That's our identity. At least we're not freed slaves. We're still white. And then it perpetuated into, well, at least we're not crack addicts. You know, we're not the criminal class. That's not our identity. My question is, the dichotomy that you organized around the modern one was they're not voting for material wealth for themselves, like welfare things for themselves, because they want to say, well, I'm not crack. I'll vote for the Bush tax cuts rather than vote for Obama or stuff like that. To me, that seems like a choice between material wealth or this identity of like, well, I'm better than the criminal class. My question is, what identity is available to those as an alternative? Because it seems like what they're seeking is identity. Is there an alternative available identity other than, well, at least I'm not criminal, at least I'm not freed slave? Is there a satisfying identity that's alternative to that?
That's a philosophical question. I'm about to pass the mic, you know. I don't know. I mean, I really want to know Angela thinks about this, but for me, it's like I don't think I don't think that there is an identity that is stable and secure and whole as long as there's oppression. You just can't have one. You know what I mean? That's the problem. And so I think as long as white supremacy reigns, white folk are still going to be unsettled too. You know, as long as patriarchy reigns, men are going to be unsettled and insecure and unwhole at all times. I think that's at the core of the issue. So no, I don't think that there is a stable one, but at least maybe we can speak to people's material needs. You know what I mean? Like maybe we can convince somebody that having money in your pocket and not being homeless is better than saying, at least I'm not him. You know what I mean? Because for me, the Bush thing is not about, it's about racializing poverty. And it's about racializing the public so that anything that's public, we imagine as black and brown, whether it's public assistance, public housing, public school, public transportation, public options, anything public we think of as black and brown, and therefore it's easy to distance ourselves from it, and so we therefore become, by default, believing in the private, and private interest and private wealth, which never benefits the people. So for me, speaking to them at that level is important, but that deeper existential question, I think is always going to linger as long as we have unfreedom prevailing.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. As I said earlier, I still have your picture poster from 1970 hanging on my wall in my parents' house in Compton, California, so thank you. And Dr. Hill, if you have a poster, I'll put it on the wall too.
I ain't willing to do it. I got to get a poster like that.
So my question is that the work of Dr. Davis said to me as being a black girl in Compton, California, that there could be somebody that looks like me that could be a PhD. And so now I am working in the prisons, providing the service as a PhD clinician. So my question is, but my concern, and I'm wondering if this is on your radar, Dr. Hill, the question is to you. I am finding that individuals, black, brown, red, and such, people of color, are now being placed in treatment facilities, caught in a net, yet they're being contained, and they're not receiving, we're not afforded the opportunity to provide them treatment because now they're segregated in an area that is, according to their PCLR scores, they're high psychopathy because they have a larger criminal history, not necessarily related to their mental health needs. And so because of that, they are segregated from everyone else, and we are providing containment as opposed to treatment. And I'm wondering, looking at the treatment facilities that are being run by correctional officers, et cetera, as opposed to clinicians, and we're only able to give them 5 or 10 minutes of clinical work. How do we, as the clinicians, stay safe and not be targeted to continue to do that work, yet also do some grassroots work on the outside so that folks are aware of that?
That's a heck of a question. I mean, I think it's complicated, right? Because we just talked about how we want treatment for people. But we'd like treatment instead of prison. right? Not treatment treatment in prison is important, but I would rather have treatment as the alternative to prison, because what happens is oftentimes in prison it just becomes another piece of the prison industrial complex. What makes it an industry is that everybody's making money off of it. And they're civilly committed, right? So they're never going to leave. They're never going to leave. So there's money in that. So the investment is not in making these people whole, because civil commitment means that I can keep you there until you're okay, and we can subjectively determine when you're okay. And the big money is in you not being okay, right? So one, we have to on a structural level reimagine what that looks like, right? We have to think about the relationship between black people and the mental health establishment historically, right? Because that's part of the problem. There's a long history in spaces of captivity for thinking of black folk as crazy. You know what I mean? Think about drapetomania, right? Which was a medical designation, a psychological condition assigned to black folk who ran away. It literally means a fear of fleeing. So black people who ran away from plantations were said to be crazy. Just let that marinate for a second. Drapetomania was a sickness that Negroes had because they kept escaping. They kept leaving. So the medical establishment has always had an investment of taking black folk in captivity and marking them as mentally unstable, right? So that continues now, right? We don't say they're mentally unstable at trial when they could actually get an alternative to prison, but once they're in prison, now we put them in spaces where we can make money off their ostensible craziness without any type of healing. So what we have to do, to answer your question, we have to work on the outside to make that fork in the road a little different so they go this way before they get to prison. When they're in prison, we have to advocate. Part of what you have to do is advocate for the same things that they get. For example, drugs. Black folk don't get drugs, medical drugs, even ones they need, at the same rate as their white counterparts. Sometimes they're over-medicated, and sometimes they're often under-medicated. So we have to advocate for that. Now, what can you do, lastly, on the ground? And this is what I tell teachers when I used to train teachers, and they say, I got this curriculum, I got No Child Left Behind, I got all this stuff that makes it hard for me to actually do the work I want to do. I say, sometimes you have to just close your door and do what you got to do, right? That's what resistance is. You have to find spaces, and that's a good way to think about all of your work, all of our work. We have to find spaces to resist, even when you're in the most corrupted, the most confining spaces possible. You have to find a way to resist. In this case, it might be stealing 10 minutes, those everyday forms of resistance that James Scott talks about. You might have to, for 10 minutes, actually give somebody therapy and not just a pill. You might have to actually listen to somebody's issue and trouble and help them work through it on the low when nobody's paying attention. That's the kind of work you can do. Find ways, all of you, find everyday ways to resist, resist, resist.
Dr. Davis, you have anything to add? Your car is waiting, so I don't want to hold you up. Do you have anything to add? I think he did a pretty good job.